speak louder. Usually I'm a good projector. So looking at the long list of cross-cutting considerations that we decided upon in Sharm el-Sheikh, I think different cross-cutting topics are going to resonate with different countries in different ways. So I think it would be hard to, in laying out a framework, to try to put these in some sort of categories or to limit the way that countries can try to either report or design or include in their adaptation actions. But I think that they're all very important in different ways. So I think that we would, at least as a starting point, keep all of the cross-cutting considerations on the table and not try to eliminate any of them at this time. But I think linking them to the different steps of the adaptation cycle may be a good starting point in terms of, you're going to think about local knowledge systems or, human rights differently at the risk and vulnerability assessment stage than find a way that makes it easy for countries to utilize these cross-cutting considerations in ways that resonate with their local circumstances.
Also, the document Shala just referred to is also linked onto the chat for virtual participants. Mariam.
Yes. Thank you so much, Thibian. Again, good morning. And well, first of all, thank you so much for Mariam and the Secretariat for preparing this document. It really maps out very well how our discussions from last year. So to start with the first question, the starting point where I looked at this was what really stands out and what's a defining element for the framework. Thank you very much. What would be a defining element of the framework? And from at least our perspective, it would be working on the actual targets, metrics, and indicators. And in the process of there are two ways of seeing the different cross-cutting elements. So some that we need to take into consideration when we are arriving at those target metrics and indicators. For example, the country drivenness. Because from our perspective, if we are to arrive, or if we should arrive at a set of global targets that are both specific enough to be able to guide international action and international cooperation on action and support for adaptation, and at the same time not be prescriptive, not to limit the policy space of countries to be able to implement actions. So we would look at through the lens of country drivenness and being able to formulate those targets. The approach that the African group has been taking is first looking at the existing targets from the different frameworks as we are seeing here, but at the same to inform from a top-down level, but at the same time looking then at the different NDCs of parties. We started with our African NDCs to try to see what kind of targets could emerge that would apply from the national level up. So we're looking at really global targets, not just national targets, that countries can both draw from and input to. So no additional burden, not being any policy prescriptive is really a starting point for the African group, and we see that reflected in the country-drivenness nature. So we also see that, for example, some approaches can really, it will be completely up to parties to apply them in light of their national contexts. Approaches such as the socio-economic policies, for example, we see that as being subject to the national circumstances and the national priorities. So we don't think we need to award that so much time in discussing it because it's pretty national and subnational. Human rights, for example, it's being discussed across different cross-cutting considerations. It's important, but it's not the lens that we're looking through. So we could see that combined, I mean, with any other cross-cutting considerations. Disaster risk reduction, again, that's part and parcel of us looking at developing the targets. So again, not a very specific lens of disaster risk reduction. It's already there when we discuss the contribution of Sendai. intergenerational equity. I think intergenerational equity is one of the important elements, as well as climate justice. We need those lenses in both defining the targets and implementation and taking progress. Intersectional approaches. I'm not sure I fully comprehend that. Again, not undermining its importance. Again, the idea of vulnerable groups, just trying to be practical. I think there are vulnerable regions or vulnerable countries that are defined under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. So these need to be taken into consideration, how the GGA is operationalized. For example, targeted support towards developing countries in the specific targets, metrics, and indicators, or some sort of time-bound focus on vulnerable regions and vulnerable populations and countries. For example, from here to 2030, we would have like an urgent and immediate specific targets that by 2030 should action and support targets that should happen in developing countries, and after which, for example, towards 2050, then we look at something that's more global, more universal, of course, not losing the essence of the global goal on adaptation. So that would be for my first question. Participatory, fully transparent in terms of needs assessment. That's of course very important, because part of what the GGA would need to achieve in a forward-looking approach, but also looking back, is see how far through the global goal on adaptation we have met the needs of particularly developing country parties that have communicated on adaptation. Until now, and looking forward, I think many countries have included in their NDCs and ADCOMs needs and targets until 2030, and some even have included beyond. Gender responsiveness is one of those that are important in a global assessment, at the same time subject to the national circumstances and the different levels where countries are at. And of course, social justice is very important, because the GGA would be tackling the adaptation gap, and adaptation action is unevenly distributed as per the IPCC among and within regions. So this is also an important consideration in designing the actual metrics, targets, and indicators. In terms of the actual design of metrics and indicators, there could be two approaches. We either look at the adaptation cycle. So for example, we work out some metrics on planning, implementation of actions, making sure that we have the existing data, climate observation, technologies, et cetera, for assessing impacts, risks, and vulnerabilities, and making sure that we are bending the curve on the risks and vulnerabilities. That would be the overall goal that we're trying to achieve with this section of the policy cycle. Of course, means of implementation and implementation of actions. It's easier to look through this dimension if we are to design the different targets, because while at the same time we need to try to seek a balance. If we focus on sectoral targets, while that links most to what the NDCs have communicated, many NDCs speak about agriculture, health, city settlements, infrastructure, but at the same time we're trying to go forward with this kind of systemic approach or transformational approach, which needs to tackle them in systems. So maybe a starting point to approach those targets would to look at the adaptation cycle. It would be as well easier to identify some sorts of target. It's both process targets and outcomes targets where possible, keeping in mind that we will have to start somewhere. If we don't have the robust monitoring and evaluation systems that would allow us to adequately capture the outcomes, then we need to understand that we will start with process and refine as we go until we have this kind of indicators or metrics that would allow us to capture the outcomes that have been achieved. I will leave it there, give a chance to others to speak, and I'll come back on the other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Any other requests from the in-person participants? Not yet. Do we have any? So we don't have, oh, sorry, Japan. Yeah.
Thank you very much for giving me a floor. And then my name is Yuka Yoshida. And then I'm very happy to see all of you again here, Glasgow, Sharm el-Sheikh Global Goal on Adaptation, the workshop. And then for the questions, I think in some giving in this cross-cutting considerations, we found some of these concepts such as nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation and locally led, LLA, locally led adaptation, and disaster risk reductions are very important and then directly contribute to the achieving the global goal on adaptation because these concepts are very important for Japan, and then we utilize these concepts to promote adaptation in the country. So I think these concepts are quite important. And then we can share the domestic experiences to here. So then, and I also, in addition, we also think the private sector engagement is also important factor. And then as we had a good discussion just yesterday. So I think we strongly recommend the private sector engagement should be included to this cross-cutting considerations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Japan. We have a virtual participant, so I will hand the floor to Britta.
Yes, good morning all. I hope you can hear me well. It's very early in the morning and my voice is not really there already. I wanted to first of all point to our discussion last year at the COP where we said that the framework shall have two functions. One is to review the overall progress in achieving the GGA. So that would be more of a backward-looking function. And the second is to guide the achievement of the GGA with a view to enhancing action and support. So that would be more of a forward-looking perspective. I think we carefully need to look at these two functions since they may require different answers and approaches when we design the framework. So we might need different answers with a view to these two functions. In that regard, we think that the framework offers an opportunity that allows for enhancing our review of collective progress in a way. And it allows us identifying global adaptation priorities, even as a foundation for global common action agenda. In that regard, the cross-cutting principles are important, but we need to see whether they require different answers with a view to these two functions, as also outlined by Cella, I think, if I understood her correctly. But we also see that many of them are important and that they can promote effective and transformative adaptation action while avoiding maladaptation. And we discussed that in particular also on the first day. So, for example, it's important to promote social justice and gender responsiveness, for example, to use the best available science, use integrated and systemic approaches, which was particularly outlined by the IPCC, get away from silos. In that regard, we also think that we need to maintain the process-oriented nature of adaptation processes and not work in silos and not work and take a sector approach, as this would not promote the integrated and systemic approach. It's important to promote the co-benefits and avoid trade-offs, including transboundary effects. And last but not least, and I think that came through quickly in all of the workshops, it's important that we have that countries set up processes that are participatory, inclusive, and enable actors to act. So not being just heard or being passive. And that applies to subnational entities and actors such as cities. I think it relates to the climate proofing of climate private sector investments. That's also very important. It's also outlined by Japan, and enable other actors to adapt. So I think they are important and they can be considered in various steps of adaptation processes, including, for example, the monitoring and evaluation, as that requires an analysis to what extent adaptation has been effective. And that, of course, requires knowledge from diverse actors and a review and an assessment. And that, of course, is very important, for example, to do at the national level. So I think many of these cross-cutting consideration can promote effective adaptation. However, we need to see with the two functions whether they equally apply there. Thank you.
Thank you, Britta. Do we have any other virtual? No, so I will hand over to the UN University.
Thank you so much. Bit of an echo. Okay. So we have been looking at the cross-cutting issues, and we felt that sharing the opinion that they are all important, that might be possible to cluster them in a way that we can better deal with them, so to say. So we felt that the diversity of these cross-cutting issues could be efficiently and appropriately operationalized under the themes equity, environment, capacity building, and interconnectedness. So on equity, we felt that goals and targets should be reflective of the socioeconomic inequalities related to gender, income, generational inequalities, ethnicity, and so on. On environment, we felt that adaptation goals need to be set in a way that they have to avoid tipping of major ecosystems. So this relates back a little bit to my contribution yesterday on global commons. So we need to set them in a way that they also safeguard planetary boundaries and large ecosystem tipping point. This would also go along with upscaling and monitoring of ecosystem-based solutions as part of an overall, adaptation strategy. We felt also that a particular aspect would be a monitoring of losses and damages of ecosystems, and especially ecosystem-based adaptation solutions, which are implemented more frequently, but we are actually not monitoring how far they are still delivering their adaptation benefits. On capacity building, as the potential third building block, we felt that adaptation, decision-making, implementation, and monitoring rely on a set of skills from communities and local actors, which include academic and also traditional knowledge. So bringing in the discussion, we had the very rich discussion we had yesterday on languages and traditional knowledge. And as a fourth building block to recognize interconnectedness, we felt that GGA could consider the systemic and interconnected nature of risk based on transboundary, transdisciplinary, cross-scale, and cross-sectoral considerations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have any request? We do. Okay. Just to note that when you speak, please speak closer to the mic. That's a request we got from the IT. So over to Morgan.
Thank you. Is that okay? Yeah. Thanks a lot, because I think this is really one of the particularly important discussions to be had, and what some of the previous speakers shared did generate some thoughts. I wonder whether in the cross-cutting elements here there is a way to both use them all or not put anything out the table. I think that what Shella was saying, but use them differently, if I understood both Britta and Mariam. I thought the proposal to try and look at them into what goes into which stage of the policy cycle was an interesting idea. And if I'm trying to open the background material, sorry, because there are different elements. I remember even when we started the work program, the element of country driven was very, very important to everyone. So I think we should really not lose these elements. But because we've had a lot of discussions on local knowledge and indigenous people or work at the community level. I think it's just we probably need a bit more discussions or a bit further. Sorry, into this one. Sorry, I need to change mic. Is that better? Okay, much better. Thank you. Trying to find a way basically to see what that just to make it clear that we're not trying to circumvent the national level, but it's what is going to be part of the way that countries want to develop their plan or implement, how they integrate the different voices at the different level. And then at the same time, hearing what we've heard in the past 2 days, like how can we integrate some of these local voices, indigenous voices, into some of the work that's being done at the global level. So I think this point on not rejecting the whether it's community based or locally, but just trying to make sure countries still remain at the center and voices are heard into some of the work that we're doing at the global level. And I think on the work on indicators and metrics, we've heard a lot. Like we had a full workshop on it last year, and I think I really heard that this continues to be a very key discussion to be had. Maybe there's also a way to try and see what it is, those science-based indicators, metrics that is going to be so led by countries, and that they're already doing so much work to integrate them in their own plans, and what it is that we need to do at the global level to try and basically do things better and enhance adaptation, action, and support. And maybe this is where it links to a bit of one of the next questions. There was a time or timeline tension here, given we have a few months, just barely a year to try and get there. So some of the ideas that we heard also informally is how can we start with building on what we have. So we have this framework, and we know we want to have different ways to assess and measure what we're going to do at the global level, and how can we start with building on a lot of like wealth of information that is out there and that are relevant for adaptation, but that it's maybe a bit scattered in all of the different UN convention or different countries or outside the system as well. How we build on this and make it more structured, and at the same time, from this point on, we'll have this analysis, and at the same time, as soon as possible, because we can't wait and action is urgent, how can we try and do things better and enhance them? So it wasn't very well structured, but I hope that helped with the discussion.
Thank you, Morgan. I see. Okay, so Binny, Nico, Mariam, do we have any other from the floor? There, so.
Hello. Yes, well, this is very loud. Thanks. I think in terms of the cross-cutting, there's a lot of things to unpack, because the way we came up with the list is also a little bit about more of a brainstorming kind of thing. So I think there are bits that fall within all the dimensions. For example, the country driven for me is very much a principle that kind of guides the whole national elements of like adaptation communication and how they're developed and how things are implemented, while gender responsiveness is a critical aspect of the dimension that falls within the vulnerabilities, impacts and risks and planning and all the processes. Some of them are options for countries to choose. So I think for me, the best approach would be to understand which appropriate level does this cross-cutting aspect fall in, and in light of that, how do countries use them in the dimensions, so within the adaptation policy cycle. So when countries work on their planning processes, how do they have gender responsiveness or those elements? Metrics and targets, for me, they sit on a kind of a separate aspect than cross-cutting. I think the exercise that we're heading towards is identifying metrics, targets, and indicators, which would help us have some sort of a figure to track our progress, to have both qualitative and quantitative approaches of tracking our progress. Best available science is a principle, particularly on the impacts, vulnerabilities, and risks in understanding how countries assess and how we use data. Same with traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge as well. So some of the bits around, for example, nature-based solutions, adaptation, community-based adaptation, ecosystem-based adaptation. This would be within the country-drivenness nature of how the GGA is framed, and how the countries would communicate their approaches, so that one, there is recognition of effort, but also there is that peer-to-peer learning in how effective adaptation can be shared across countries.
Thank you, Benny. Nico?
Yes, sorry. Yes, thank you. Thank you for putting us those questions for the discussion. First, we see that the framework and itself, the goal, it has a collective nature of how you gather and present the information. It is, even though the information could come from the countries, it has the nature of that information as is aggregated, is a collective assessment. So in that regards, that is in line with the GST and also with other goals under the Paris Agreement. Then we see some things that are included in the cross-cutting elements as the metrics and targets. That is something that is another kind of thing in terms of this is something that is going to be included in each of the crosses or pieces of the framework. What is the baseline of each of the, for instance, if we look at water and impacts, what is the baseline of that cross? What is the methodology where you have measure whatever indicator come up from this, and of course what could be a target. So in that line, we call like the narrative within the best available science and science-based indicators, as was referred previously by some colleagues. It's important as well. We see a added value from the IPCC that has already established a baseline on what are the climate risks at different levels of global warming, at different hazards and different sectors that could be a baseline, and itself it could be an impact indicator where we can see whether the adaptations, the efforts of adaptation are coming and reducing that climate risk that was assessed, for instance, in the AR6, and what is the next level on the AR7, and so on and so forth. Then we have as well different other elements that come along with, in particular, how the information has been prepared. If that information, for instance, the climate risk assessment or the design of the adaptation measures of the implementation of those were included the gender response, it has considerations on social justice, or it was included some information on local knowledge, indigenous, it consider intergenerational equity, intersectional approaches, that kind of information that is relevant when you are addressing the different parts of the adaptation cycle. And there are other types of information that as well is included in the cross-cutting considerations, that is ways to adapt. So you have the communities-based approach, the ecosystem-based adaptation, the relation between other actors, as some countries have referred previously. Yeah, that kind of information is how you are addressing that that implementation of adaptation actions. And yeah, definitely we see that those at the end we have like different things in the cross-cutting considerations. So this idea of clustering, maybe whether these things are related to each other, maybe on what are the things that were based for assessing climate risk or based for implementing adaptation actions, would be one kind of things. Then you have the metrics and targets. Then you have what this is, this idea of best available science, and you have types of implementation. So we see that there is a different things here, but we would need to at least have an understanding of clustering those elements. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. Mariam?
Press my laptop instead of the mic. So thanks for giving me the floor again. I'll say a few reflections on the specific questions and maybe also interact with the responses. So maybe on the first question, in addition to the point on the cross-cutting issues, I think I very much like the idea that we've all raised, that different cross-cutting considerations fit in different stages of the cycle, many of which will be clearly reflected in the targets, but some of which are essentially in the national level action completely without any prescriptive or imposed manner. So again, party driven. Second, on the different levels of action, well, we always hear across the room, locally led, although we prefer to say adaptation on different levels from the local to the global. So local, subnational, national, global, not just limiting action to a specific level, because of course, adaptation is quite context specific, but the planning in most countries does happen on a national level and evolves down to the most local level. So these different varying levels need to be respected and reflected as well in the framework. So national, subnational, and local, and of course the global goal being global in nature. That's my other response. The third response is regarding the private sector. I think the private sector is a very important actor on adaptation. I think our role here is not to enable the private sector only. I think our role here is focused on countries and populations, private sectors being one of many actors. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of that and give a very specific focus on the private sector that really shifts our focus away from all other actors that are primarily targeted, which are populations and communities. So that's very important. It's also important not to duplicate efforts. And this takes me to the second question. There's a whole non-state actor agenda under the Marrakesh Partnership, and it's the high-level champions, and they mobilize action from non-state actors, including the private sector. So it would be good to ensure complementarity, but again, to focus on what we need to focus on. Private sector is very important, so we can see how the high-level champions are filling this action by non-state actors, including the private sector. So really important to recognize the work they are doing. I know that they have the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation agenda, which sets clear targets for action to mobilize support from non-state actors. And I think we could benefit from the approach that they had done, particularly in engaging the private sector, not to duplicate effort. And in the same vein, as well facilitating existing reporting systems. There are so many merits into looking at how countries have been collecting data, reporting under the Sendai and CBD biodiversity frameworks and targets. Again, I think right now under the Sendai framework review and the new CBD target/framework, it's also important to integrate information from these without the actual duplication of efforts. So much work that happens on biodiversity, it's already happening under the biodiversity, so we don't need to recreate the wheel. It's already there. Also, as part of the Sendai framework review, they are focusing on strengthening the linkages on climate change. So we need to utilize that without being fully invested in recreating it. So that will be very important. In countries already, when they report, they have statistics. Most countries, and I can speak for mine as well, in many African countries, they have central the statistics agencies and departments will collect data across this reporting. Again, not creating any additional reporting burden, particularly for African countries and developing countries. On the issue of taking account targets that are both backward-looking and forward-looking, also the evidence, I will tackle these two questions together, and I very much agree with what Nico from Ecuador has mentioned right now, is that in order to identify what is backward-looking, what is forward-looking, you need to create kind of a baseline. And the baseline is really provided in the best available science in the IPCC. There are different sources where we can extract the baselines and the baselines that we work with. For example, right now, the IPCC tells us we've reached a 1.1 degree Celsius of warming, and there's these associated impacts. And then at the same time, we have the synthesis of the NDCs that tell us on which track we are, and then the IPCC substantiates that into scenarios and impacts. So that would be a credible baseline. Another baseline as well that we will need to integrate is the baselines on the existing processes that we have. So we have the NDCs, we have the adaptation communications and others, where countries indicate what activities that they need to implement, most of which have existed. For example, the NAPs have existed long before the NDCs. So we need to take these into account, the state of their implementation, the state of planning, the state of access to finance, et cetera, et cetera. So starting all the way back from the Cancun adaptation framework and seeing how far we have implemented this and where does it look, where are we positioned right now that we're looking forward. There is as well different pieces of work where we can find this information on baselines and moving forward, and also the support, and they exist in the needs. So needs identified in the technology needs assessments and technology action plans under the technology mechanism. We have also the work on capacity gaps and needs in accessing funding for the process to formulate and implement NAPs. We have the needs assessment report as well of the Standing Committee on Finance, which happens regularly, biennially, if I'm not mistaken. So you could use the IPCC for the baseline on impacts. We could use those different pieces of documents on the needs. We could complement this as well, where there are information gaps from major credible reports. We have, for example, the adaptation gap report, which provides information across the different parts of the adaptation gap, and many others. So I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. We don't have any virtual questions yet. Request for the floor. So I'm handing to Aisha from IFRC.
Thank you. I just wanted to reflect on the latest IPCC findings, saying that we need all hands on deck and we have no time to lose. So while I agree with the country-driven approach, I think it's really, really important to put emphasis on locally led adaptation. So for example, in the context of the Maldives, it needs to be island-driven and bridging that gap to the global goal of adaptation. So for that to happen, you need to create, there needs to be an enabling environment for communities to make informed decisions. And for that, capacity building needs to be catered for. And reflecting back on yesterday's UNICEF's intervention, children need to be at the center. I agree with that because of the intergenerational equity and justice issues. Youth, specifically capacity building elements needs to be there. And also for women and other marginalized or vulnerable groups, specific capacity building components needs to be there so that that enabling environment is created for locally led adaptation to happen, and taking that whole of society approach, where all hands on deck are there to bring that transformational change that is so urgently needed. Thank you.
Thank you. So we now do have a virtual request, 2 virtual requests for the floor. First, let me hand over to Britta from the EU.
Yeah, I assume since we are also proceeding to the other discussion questions, I wanted to share, maybe as we are discussing the idea of locally led adaptation, an approach we use in the EU is the subsidiarity principle. That means devolving decision-making to the lower level as it is possible. And I think that reflects also the idea that Mariam was highlighting, and that is being discussed. So that's something we might want to consider with a view to the other points that have been addressed in the room. I also think, like Binyam said, the principle of country-drivenness is very important. So I think we need to maintain that country-driven nature of adaptation processes. And I think with a view to question 4, that's also something we have learned. I think we also need to keep that process-oriented view of adaptation processes. Furthermore, in that regard, I think the Cancun Agreement and the 4 dimensions that we established there have proven useful and has proven as a useful approach. I think, however, what we've also learned that it's important that we take a solution action-oriented approach to enhance action and support along these 4 dimensions. So how can we improve risk assessment? How can we improve planning? How can we improve the implementation and monitoring and evaluation of actions? I think what is important in this context that we are very careful with introducing targets and indicators and top-down approaches. So I think that's something where we said why the country-driven approach is very important. And in that regard, I think that's the approach we have also defined with the Paris Agreement, where countries define their priority targets. And I think that is very important. So I think we should be careful not just to choose a global target or indicator just because we can, because it has to be useful. It has to guide us towards better action. I think in that regard, we can also look at the 2 functions, whether we look at the review of progress or whether we discuss enhancing action and support, because the risk is that we, by choosing targets or global approaches, we can also create lock-in effects. So we need to be really careful that any target or indicator discussion really leads us into the right direction. And that's why the country-driven nature of all this is and maintains very important. And we also need to be aware that that is where we need the analytics. We need it at the local level. We need it at the country level. And we should be careful not to overload the global process with that kind of analytics, because as we've also heard from the numbers and the presentations from the African representative yesterday, for example, we lack this kind of analysis at the local level where the action has to be implemented. So that's a bit of maybe a word of caution on the approach we are taking. Coming back on one other aspects on and what we have learned and on the evidence we can build on, I mentioned already the Cancun adaptation framework. And in that regard, we discussed a lot, how can we move from incremental towards transformative adaptation? In the Cancun Agreement, we said that mainstreaming is very important. So legally, we have it there, but in practice, we see too little progress. We also already laid the foundation to have mid and long-term planning with a view to climate change related impacts. So getting away from the climate variability perspective. I think that foundation is also there. Maybe at this point we need to go a step further and think about how we can improve the risk analysis in countries, including cascading risks or transboundary risks. So really starting from what we have built already, not only in countries, but also at the global level. I think that's an area where we needed maybe to have another discussion so that we build on what we have established already. Thank you.
Thank you, Britta. I'm going to give it to, we have another virtual intervention, so I'm handing to the IOM.
Good morning, colleagues. Thank you, moderator, for giving me the floor. I have 2 quick points, which is building upon the previous speakers. I think the first point is that I think it will be quite important that in the guidance material that is provided by this group to the parties, there is a clear description of what each of these cross-cutting issues cover. As it has been pointed out before, that the cross-cutting issues could be interpreted quite differently by different countries or groups within the countries. It might be necessary to provide the widest possible, let's say, description of each of the cross-cutting issues, because that would be quite necessary for the, let's say, the experts who use it to build up the indicators at the national and the subnational level. Often we have seen that people tend to have a very rigid interpretation of the guidance material they receive. And so if the descriptions are quite limited and narrow, it might be a challenge for mainstreaming of certain issues in future. And the second point is also building upon what Britta was just saying, but also other speakers, is that you do have to find a balance between what you can suggest from the global level, but also leave the flexibility for the national level actors to define the targets and the indicators as they say fit in their context. And in that circumstance, what would be quite useful is that if each of those cross-cutting issues come with a bank of sample targets or indicators. I'm not saying that that's what the national level actors should follow, but having a bank of sample targets and indicators would be quite helpful for experts at the national level, because a lot of this work is done also very quickly at the national level. And second, if those sample indicators and targets are clustered under different cross-cutting issues, it might also help with future monitoring of the progress. Thank you.
Thank you, IOM. Now I'm handing it back to the floor to Shella.
Thank you so much. It's nice to finally be getting down to some of the substance of our discussions, and it's been really interesting to hear some of the reflections on the cross-cutting issues and how they fit into the development of a framework. I heard that, this was sort of a brainstorming, the way that these different elements came into the decision, and I've liked some of the ideas around clustering or categorizing these different considerations in a way that helps countries understand how they might be applied in terms of how we measure progress on the global goal and adaptation. I think that might be useful in order to make a little bit more sense. And I think one of the things that I'm starting to hear and reflect on from these discussions is the idea of simplifying a lot of the things that we've brought into the GGA work program and came into the decision on developing a framework. We started with a long list and a lot of ideas, and in order to come to a conclusion or develop a framework, I think we need to start at the simplest level possible. I think many of us that have been following this issue agree that an ideal outcome would be something that we could explain to our ministers very simply and that they would understand and also be able to communicate, because the global goal on adaptation often doesn't get the political attention it's due because it's complicated and adaptation is complicated. So in developing a framework with possible targets or ways to measure progress, I think we should start as simply as possible. And then as we see what countries are able to report on or how they are able to demonstrate their progress, that we can iterate on that in the future. That was one thing I took away from the CBD biodiversity targets presentation on the first day, is that there were many iterations before the conclusion in December. And it was really interesting to see the different ways that they have reflected on measuring progress on biodiversity that led to the targets they arrived at that are much easier to communicate. So those are just some initial reflections. We will have a chance to explore how this framework works in the future. Trying to get everything in on this big outcome at COP28 is going to make it really hard, and really trying to drill down on what is going to communicate the GGA in the best way possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Shella. Mariam?
Thank you very much. Sibi, again, I'll be brief. I think I really wanted to touch upon the point as well of the multi-levels of adaptation action. And I think it's very important to differentiate what is our mandate in working on adaptation and the locally led considerations. So once again, I don't think it's our job to put it upon ourselves to devolve decision making, but to ensure that adaptation is happening at the local level and planning is happening at the local level as well, and inputs to the national level. So I understand that that a specific political objective that some countries and unions are doing is to take a political direction to devolve decision making. For example, some countries are quite central, some countries are federal, some countries are decentralized. These are really political systems that we cannot really change, but we can. What we need to ensure is that action is happening at the most local level that is needed, and the participation of local actors in setting the agenda and the priorities and the implementation is happening as fast enough, as urgent enough. And I wanted to substantiate a little bit why this is important. If we want to achieve this transformational systemic shift when it comes to adaptation, action cannot happen in piecemeal. And I think we said it yesterday many times. So if a million actors, everyone undertakes a small action that is not part of a bigger systemic shift that is country owned, country led, and country planned, involving all actors at all the different levels, we will not be able to achieve this transformation because it requires coordinated action. In the same manner, actions that happen nationally and nationally determined, there needs to be some sort of a coherent approach and overall vision that happens at the global level. And that's what we're trying to achieve through the global goal and adaptation, to achieve this systemic shift and achieve this adaptation response coverage across the different regions and across the whole world. And maybe an example when it comes to accessing support, the Green Climate Fund requires a no objection letter, and the no objection letter needs to be provided by the central government. So if we devolve this decision making to the local actors without it being part of the national and the country-driven sustainable development agenda that streamlines and integrates climate action, it will really not be feasible on the ground. So what I'm saying is local action is important. Adaptation happens at the most local action. Local priorities and needs target setting needs to happen, needs to be integrated in national action, but again, not to lose sight of the whole scale that needs to be integrated to be able to achieve this transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariam. Just letting you know that we have a couple minutes left, so I'll just take the final interventions. So we do have a virtual intervention from Timo, so I'll hand over the floor.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Two brief comments. One is on the third question, which is the targets that are backward and forward looking. I have a little difficulty imagining what a backward looking target is. I mean, the concept of a target always has to refer to the future. So if you're a football team, you can't say our target is to win last season. because last season is over, is the past. So I mean, I guess I understand what the idea is, but the term target as what a target can only ever refer to the future, but then the backward-looking aspect would be to see where do we stand in regard to the target. But so just wanted to mention this point because a target for the past. I mean, again, the past is over. And then a reflection on what the colleague from IOM just said. I fully get this, the desire for possible lists of indicators, and because all countries are wondering, okay, what indicators to choose for their NUPs. In fact, the UK is currently in the process of looking for indicators for their next NUP. But these lists could get endless. So if we were to try to brainstorm potential indicators for countries in all types of different sectors, these would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of potential indicators. And of course, UNFCCC would need to have some sort of quality check if that was to be done. So I don't think that would be a feasible exercise. There could be other publications or other documents or research publications listing different indicators, but I don't see that UNFCCC would agree on very, very long lists of potential indicators that somebody might choose. I would like to make this point on potential feasibility. Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have any other requests from our virtual participants. So with that, we have a couple from our in-person. I'm so sorry, I'm not sure what your name is, but the floor is yours. Please do introduce yourself.
It's on. Okay, sorry. Check. I'm Edna Kaptoyo. So I wear two hats from the Indigenous Peoples community, but also I support the Africa Social Cultural Region as the facilitative working group member to the el-Sheikh. I've listened to the discussions, and I think in terms of the cross-cutting considerations, a number of them, some could be clustered into areas, and I agree with UNU assertions, into different categories. But of course, all are important, really, consideration that also can fit into the adaptation cycle itself. And I think the aspect that they're also important for advancing local action and the collective action really, and really can support the driving of GGA as a bottom-up process as well. And it's essential really to reflect on local realities really, because that is what can inform the global level goal. And I think in terms of building upon existing reporting systems, it's important because it can help, because they're already existing foundation, like in the CBD process already, on even how they've been able to take this cross-cutting consideration into really main elements of the target, like inclusion of indigenous peoples and local communities, how they've been able to take aspects of traditional knowledge into really the main target frameworks. So we could take that on board. And also, I think within the Paris Agreement, there are various vehicles of where countries have really, and other people have been able to share a lot of adaptation communications and information within the NDCs and NAPs. And I think that could be built up on instead of reinventing the wheel. And also, I think the other element is really how all these within the dimension, and I like that within the dimension, there's the aspect of evaluation and learning, because I think it goes beyond really for us looking at just metrics and indicators which are really broad and sometimes can't fit into some contexts. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. So just to let everyone know, my current list is Bini, the UN University, Nico, Morgan, Tunisia, and also Mariam. Mariam, you're also requesting the floor as well. Yeah. Is there anyone else who would like to request the floor? No. Okay, then I'm closed. Oh, sorry. Cuba. Okay. Yep. Vinny.
Thank you very much, and I'll be very brief. I think one of the things that we are all struggling, in my understanding, is understanding what the global element of the adaptation process that we're trying to look at within the GGA is. And then because there is a lot of work that has been undertaken at the local level, at the national level, and the regional level, but not much on the global level. So I think we're all struggling to understand that. But I think we need to, through this GGA process, we really need to understand, because we'll always come back to this. The reason why we've been working for parity between adaptation and mitigation is because we haven't focused on what the global nature of that adaptation response is. And the whole purpose is to enhance adaptation action and support. So what's the role of the Secretariat in this? What's the role of parties in this? What's the role of the global community in this, CSOs in this? We need to iron that out, and that's part of understanding what the global process is for me. So structurally understanding that would help us at least understand how the goals translate and what the responsibility of each respective actors would be. One additional point I want to make, maybe links to the second question, is the reference to other goals. I think we have to be conscious about some of the additional thinkings we need to have in transplanting some of these goals, which is do we then take the reporting processes from that? Do we take learnings from that process, for example, Sendai framework, SDGs? Do we take that findings, assessments, processes, and transplant them as well? Or do we just take the goals as it is, adopt them, and create a structure of assessment within the UNFCCC process? So these are some of the detailed thinkings we need to have on transplanting some goals from other processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Bini. UN University.
Thank you so much. Does it work? Yes. So I very much agree with what Benny said, and working out the global part of the goal is an important aspect. And reflecting back on what Britta said, for example, about looking into how we can improve risk assessments, including also systemic and transboundary considerations, and connecting to what Benny said. I think this transboundary element is what the GGA could ask for, because this is usually not necessarily happening on the country level or on the local level. So the transboundary element could be something we are aiming for, among others, in the GGA process. And reflecting shortly on goals, for example, from Sendai. So from our perspective, what is missing there is the different global warming scenarios and the time element. So when we are looking into adaptation, we will need to consider probably a longer time frame than by 2030, and under different climate scenarios. So this is kind of where we need to embed those reporting processes, but somehow reflect on the nature that those are not necessarily considering climate change scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll hand over to Nico, and then we have our final virtual intervention, and then back to the in-person.
Yes, thank you. Quickly as well, we would like to reflect on 3 points. One is on the other reporting systems, as just our colleague from the university, from the academy stated. There might be different frameworks, but not all of them would consider something related to climate change. So maybe those are extreme weather events or slow onset events, but are not related to different levels of global warming, projected climate risks, or take into account different emission scenarios. So these considerations are key to draw information from any reporting system. Otherwise, we will be including information that is not related to the climate change arena, that has a specific understanding on what is the scope of work and the mandate. And in addition, other targets, for instance, the biodiversity targets, those as well come from a different technical work, from different mode of work as well, and different mandates. So yeah, we will need to be careful on considering other reporting systems, because those are framed and built under different context considerations, mandates, principles. So that is key to have in mind. Other thing is on the backward looking target. Yeah, I think maybe the question is deviating our attention on the purpose of the backward looking, is to see whether where is the standing point. So we very much agree on the virtual speaker, on the function of the GGA as having where are we in terms of looking at the backward looking, and what is our aspirational point with the target that would be the forward looking aspect. Yeah, and the third point is on the nature. As we previously stated, we understand that the information would come from the countries and from different systems, but as well the nature of what we will collect is a collective nature of information. We will, even though that we will have different particularities and different conditions and contexts from the countries, from the communities within those countries, at the end, the assessment is at a collective level, at a global level. So yeah, we as well need to bear in mind that that is the nature of the information, and as well that is the way that it would serve the GST. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. I'll hand over to our final virtual intervention from the Philippines.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good afternoon again. We support the insights for the GCA framework being country-driven based on comprehensive risk assessments, as this will provide granular data and information reflective of national circumstances. On metrics, we would need data collection and generation as necessary to come up with new
Sorry to
assessments.
interrupt you. Your voice is now not as clear. Can you speak closer to your mic, please?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, there's some background noise. So could you just speak closer to the mic? Thanks.
Okay. I'll just share again. We support the insights for the GGA framework being country-driven, based on comprehensive risk assessments, as this will provide granular data and information reflective of national circumstances. On metrics, we would need data collection and generation as necessary to come up with new assessments to be able to develop common metrics, both qualitative and quantitative, which are comparable and rateable, based on risk assessment, SNAPs, NDC, specifically on its adaptation component and ACs. Framework should also be using an integrative approach that is comprehensive and holistic, including references to original and evolving data and information, further cross-reference with the needs of the developing countries identified in their NAPs and ACs. We also highlight the importance of risk assessment and risk management approaches, including DRRL. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippines. So could you please put your intervention into the chat as well, because it still was a bit unclear, so that way we can ensure we capture your points. Handing over back to our in-person participants, to Mariam. And then I have Morgan, Tunisia, and then Cuba.
Thanks, Debbie. Not to take long, my points have already been made by Binny and Nico, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Miriam. Morgan?
Thank you. Just a few quick points to react on some of the things that were said earlier. And thanks, Timo. I think you're the one who came back on the good point on list of indicators. It's true that we are in the UK, we're developing our third NAP, and just in our context, we're talking about hundreds of indicators because they include the current one and also proxy indicators. So it's, and I think we've talked about this before about the country-drivenness nature and the fact that all countries need to be able and it should be flexible enough for them to develop the data there. But just a key learning that we've had in developing this list of indicators and proxy indicators is that if those are not developed with the people that need to gather the data, then they're pretty much useless. As this came from some of the previous risk assessment that we've had from the Independent Climate Change Committee in the UK, and you can have the best indicator in the world if they're not being developed with those that need to own them, then you just won't have the data and you won't be able to use it. So just something to consider. And I do agree with the point. I think it was you, Mariam, who mentioned the importance of the mainstreaming element. And same for our third NAP, the mainstreaming and good governance are really key in the development. This is really not easy, and sometimes it also makes it easier to track. But at the same time, it remains also a key finding of the IPCC Working Through report and something for us to consider. And just on the global level element, I think it was you, Binyam, who mentioned it. I think I agree. There's the point on the aim to enhance adaptation, action, and support. And I think this is where a point on the analysis is key. And we have the link to the global stocktake this year, where we know we will learn and we'll have this kind of global assessment. And we'll discuss this in the next session, but just also linking it to the presentation from Argentina yesterday. I think there were quite a few really good points on the ambition cycle, on the case studies and the analysis part, and really on how to enhance things over time to, I think it was Bruder who put it, avoid lock-in, but still take action now. And very briefly on, I think, Nico's point, I agree. I think we need to look at these linkages with others quite carefully. But I thought it was quite showing the amount of submissions from non-party stakeholders, other UN organizations, and the numerous presentations that we've had also last year over some of our workshops really show both interest but clear linkages, and that link to the idea of mainstreaming that I mentioned before. But maybe some of the work that we need to do is on exactly what and how, so that it's not just taking things from others, but really looking at what would it do, how could that enhance some of the work that we're trying to do. Thanks.
Thank you. Tunisia?
Is it working? Okay. Hello, everyone. So I want to focus on the second question, that is, how can the GGA framework build on and facilitate ensuring existing reporting systems? Because I see that this is a really important point, and colleagues already talked about several aspects on how the GGA framework can facilitate and the existing reporting system. So I guess that the global DGA framework can align with existing reporting system, ensuring that they are complementary and reinforcing. For example, the framework can incorporate the reporting requirements of the Sendai framework and the CBD biodiversity targets, enabling countries to report on their progress towards achieving multiple goals simultaneously. Also, another thing the framework can do is to facilitate the coordination between existing reporting systems, ensuring that they are not duplicating, as Mariam mentioned, and that countries are not reporting on the same indicators multiple times. And this can save time and resources for countries and promote more efficient reporting. Another point is that I see really important that the framework can provide standard reporting templates and guidelines. And I'm talking here about 2 countries, making it easier for countries to report on their progress towards achieving the GGA and other related goals. And this is also can facilitate the comparison of data across countries, enabling better benchmarking and learning. Also, I see that capacity building is needed here. The framework can support capacity building efforts related to reporting, especially in developing countries. For example, the framework can provide technical assistance and training to countries to improve their data collection, the analysis, and the reporting capabilities, because some countries, unfortunately, they don't have the necessary capacities to do the reporting in a good way. Also, the last point is the framework can integrate with existing reporting systems at the national and subnational levels, and this can ensure that the reporting systems are coherent and aligned with national priorities and needs. Thank you.
Okay, so we are going to continue this discussions in the plenary. So very quickly, over to Cuba.
Thank you, and thank you, and good morning to you all. I'm new at these discussions, and of course I'm speaking on behalf of Cuba, not on behalf of G77 and China. And in order to be quick, I think we can avoid repetitions in these discussions at the same repetition that we're referring to the data collections and the burden that could be put on developing countries, mostly because, as you all know, we have a very in some countries we have not very strong data collection systems. I'm very lucky to say that in Cuba we have. We try to enhance that, but is very challenging with these with these new indicators, with this new data. Anyways, my point is that mostly what I wanted to say is being said by our colleagues in a better shape way. And for example, in Marian with the level of governance, I think we should focus on local communities. We should focus on local level, because it's at the end is where the results are reflected in. But at the same time, we shouldn't avoid, or we should take into account that a national level that has a position as coordinate or the planning and the data collection mostly, or the implementation of national plans. We were talking about that in from several years now. And the other thing that I wanted to reflect is mostly more is more likely with the work I've been doing in the UN in New York, is referring to different processes that are being held now in New York. That's been there are ongoing processes, and also another reference to other processes that are in different parts of the world. I'm referring to the Sendai framework review process and also CBD action plan that we need to capture. Of course, those as a climate change is a very is a global concern issue. All those processes, and I think mostly every process in the UN refers to climate change impacts, but we need to take into account the specific context where those processes, as the Sendai framework, are being built on. There, as Mariam says, there's a review process, and there's a political declaration being negotiated now in New York on the Sendai, and there's a strong focus, of course, in climate change adverse impacts and climate change risks. but the scope that this process has, as Nico mentioned, is the scope of disaster risk reduction, although they have a very important elements on building resilience. And I think building resilience is also, as you all know, is also an important element of adaptation plans and adaptation actions. So, but the discussions, what I'm trying to say is that those discussions, we need to reflect that, or we can reflect that those discussions are being held, but in a way of how it can be incorporated for the GGA, but with the scope of adaptation and the scope of what we've been talking on the GGA or on adaptations within the context of the UNFCCC and in the context of the implementation of the Paris Agreement and all that. And that brings me to referring to the nature-based solutions concepts. Even in the UNED resolution, and I know this is it's not a new initiative, but it's not an agreed concept within the whole membership in the United Nations. There's not per se definition, even in the United resolution. If you take a look at it, they said that further discussions are needed in incorporating that. And when you look at the elements that are captured in the United resolution, you can perceive that there's a duplication of concepts that are captured as well in some other documents. So we shouldn't try to reinvent the wheel. We should keep the focus on what we want to do, and I think achieving a global goal adaptation or implementation of that framework should be the main focus, and not deviate the discussion and trying to bring elements that can be that wide elements that we are not making a new 2030 agenda here with the global goal and adaptation, and that's what we're trying to say. So in time, back to you, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So very quickly, we are all now required to go back downstairs to join the plenary. So we'll report back, and these discussions can still continue with everyone else. So everyone, please do join the main group. So virtual participants as well, back to the main link. Thank you.